I stood in the middle of the party my son threw to celebrate his new home, the same house he had just kicked me out of. In my hand was a wooden box holding my new will and a USB with every cruel thing they'd done. When the lawyer walked in, the room went silent. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to catch more shocking episodes like this one. The morning mist clung to the hills of Pinebrook like a silk veil, cool, stubborn, and slow to lift. Somewhere beyond the cypress trees, the sun struggled to break through the clouds, casting a soft gray light over the garden beds lined with dahlias and bluebells. Evelyn Monroe, 74, knelt beside a weathered patch of marigolds, gloved hands deep in soil that smelled of dew and memory. Her movements were slow but precise dig-pat clip, the way she used to grade essays, meticulous, unsparing, personal. Behind her stood the old colonial house she had called home for more than 4 decades, a yellow-stoned villa with ivy gripping its sides like an old secret. The shutters rattled faintly in the wind, and the wooden floorboards inside groaned with every change in temperature. To Evelyn, it was music. She paused, stretching her back, and glanced down the slope where the fog crept across Silver Lake. The reflection of the hills shimmered like a watercolor, unfinished but lovely. A robin landed on the edge of the planter box and tilted its head at her. She smiled faintly. It reminded her of Grace. Grace had always loved birds. As a little girl, she would leave tiny bowls of water along the windowsills. "So they have somewhere to drink, Mama," she'd say with wide, serious eyes. That was a long time ago. Grace had died of cancer at 27. A pain so sharp and permanent, Evelyn sometimes forgot how to breathe when she thought of her. She had been the gentle one, the one who whispered poems in French and played the piano like it was woven into her soul. When Grace passed, Evelyn had stopped playing music altogether. The piano still sat in the foyer, silent and dust-covered, a relic to a life frozen in grief. And then there was Henry, her husband, a man who had been charming, ambitious, and always a little elsewhere. He had left when their son was only 5, first in spirit, then in presence. One day his suitcase was gone. So was he. No note, no goodbye, just the sound of the screen door banging in the wind. So Evelyn raised their son Daniel alone. She kept her job teaching French literature at the high school in town. She saved every penny. She learned to fix pipes, repair gutters, and drive through blizzards to get Daniel to his violin lessons. She worked, waited, endured, because that's what strong women did, and that's what mothers did when no one else would. She stood slowly, bones aching, and made her way to the mailbox nestled under the dogwood tree. It creaked when opened, as if reluctant to let go of its contents. Inside was a single white envelope bordered in gold. She opened it carefully. "To Mrs. Evelyn Monroe, we warmly invite you to the 50-year reunion of Rosebridge High School faculty." She read it twice. The names came rushing back. Colleen at the front desk, Mr. Benson, who always spilled coffee, students who called her Madame Monroe. The scent of chalk, the clang of lockers, the rustle of literature anthologies long out of print. She folded the invitation slowly and set it on the stone bench. Then she turned back toward the house. She would not go. She had said her goodbyes to the past, and the past had answered in kind. The kettle whistled in the kitchen. She poured herself a cup of jasmine tea and sat in her favorite armchair by the window. From here she could see the willow tree Grace had planted when she was 10. It still stood gnarled and beautiful. That's when the doorbell rang. 3 soft chimes, hesitant, the kind of knock people give when they're unsure of the welcome. She opened the door. Daniel. He stood on the porch in slacks and a collared shirt she didn't recognize, holding a leather weekend bag. His hair was neatly combed, but his eyes were tired. Behind him stood a young woman, elegant, poised, and out of place in the damp mountain air. Her name, Evelyn would soon learn, was Vanessa. Daniel smiled a little too quickly. "Hi, Mom. This is Vanessa, my wife." Wife. Evelyn blinked. She hadn't known he was married. She had heard about a girlfriend, a woman he'd met at the insurance company in the city. But not this. Not matrimony. Not a life event she'd been excluded from. Vanessa stepped forward and extended a manicured hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mrs. Monroe. Daniel talks about you all the time." Evelyn took her hand briefly. "Come in." They stepped inside with the cautious reverence of people entering a museum. Vanessa's gaze flitted around the foyer like a camera lens, taking everything in the chandelier, the antique mirror, the framed photos that hadn't been dusted in weeks. They sat down at the breakfast table where the teapot still steamed faintly. Small talk followed. The weather, the drive from the city, the charm of Pinebrook, how quaint the town seemed. Vanessa complimented the hardwood floors, the crown molding the vintage charm of the furniture. Then slowly the conversation shifted. Daniel leaned forward. "Mom, there's something we wanted to ask you." Evelyn waited. "We've been struggling a bit." "Financially," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Rent in the city's insane, and work's been unpredictable. Vanessa's department just downsized." Vanessa's smile remained intact, but her fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. "We thought Daniel continued just temporarily. We could maybe stay here just for a few months, until things level out." Evelyn said nothing. "We'd help out around the house," Vanessa added. "You wouldn't even know we were here. We'd be in and out. Quiet." Evelyn looked at her son. The boy who used to cry when she left him at daycare, who used to draw her clumsy portraits with oversized hearts around her name, who used to ask, "Are you proud of me, Mom?" after every spelling test. She took a breath. "Fine," she said. "A few months. But the house stays the way it is. I like things quiet." "Of course," Daniel said quickly. "We're really grateful." Vanessa's smile brightened. "It's going to be wonderful." Evelyn wasn't sure if she meant the arrangement or the house. As they moved their bags inside, Evelyn returned to her chair by the window. Her tea had gone cold. In the garden, the willow tree swayed slightly in the breeze like it was watching. She had survived 1,000 storms in this house. She had no idea that one more cunning, more personal, was already knocking on her door. The first week passed like a gentle breeze through the hills, soft, harmless, even comforting. It had been years since Evelyn Monroe had heard the sound of another pair of slippers padding across the floor, the click of dishes in the sink, that she hadn't dirtied herself, or the occasional hum of an unfamiliar voice upstairs. Vanessa was surprisingly warm at first. She insisted on making tea in the afternoons and served it in Evelyn's antique porcelain set, though she never asked permission to use it. Daniel fixed the trellis out back that had been leaning ever since last spring's storm. He even replaced a few roof tiles that Evelyn had been quietly fretting about, but hadn't found the energy to climb up and inspect herself. At dinner, they set the table as a trio. Vanessa cooked stir-fry on their first evening, wearing a crisp apron and humming a French tune Evelyn hadn't heard since she left the classroom. "I looked it up," Vanessa had said when Evelyn asked. "Figured you'd enjoy something nostalgic." That made Evelyn blink. It wasn't unkind, just unexpected. The dining room filled with conversation. Daniel spoke about his job, how the insurance sector had been unpredictable lately, how the city felt more stressful than it used to, how they just needed time to recalibrate. Evelyn nodded, listening, observing. He laughed more than he used to, but it was a laugh with an edge tight, manufactured like a man performing his own optimism. Still, something softened in her that night. Watching her son reach for the soy sauce, wipe the table with a napkin, lean into his wife's shoulder with casual intimacy, it was something like peace. Perhaps he had finally grown into the man she hoped he would become. Perhaps time, after all its cruelty, still knew how to redeem itself. Later that evening, Evelyn sat alone on the back porch, a blanket over her knees, sipping the last of her chamomile tea. The sky above Pinebrook was swirled with stars. Somewhere a dog barked in the valley below, and an owl answered from the tree line. She closed her eyes and allowed herself for the first time in a very long while to hope. By the end of the second week, Evelyn began to notice changes in the rhythm of the house. Not jarring ones, just subtle shifts. A book on the coffee table she hadn't placed there, a lavender candle in the bathroom that hadn't been hers. The photo of Grace on the mantel had been moved slightly to the left, twice. Then one morning she came into the living room and froze. The photograph wall was different, not missing, just rearranged. The central frame of her children, Grace and Daniel sitting on the back steps in their school uniforms, had been replaced with a modern print of abstract art blue swirls and jagged strokes, the kind you find in corporate lobbies. Some of the older family portraits, her parents on their wedding day, Grace in her cap and gown, Evelyn holding baby Daniel at the hospital, were no longer on display. In their place were minimalistic decor items, a metal sculpture, a neutral-toned mirror, 2 large candles. It wasn't just a redecorating choice, it was erasure. She stood there for a long minute, hand gently resting on the mantel. When Vanessa walked in holding her morning smoothie, she smiled without missing a beat. "Oh, you noticed. I was thinking we could modernize a bit, make the space breathe. You know how cramped too many frames can feel, right?" Evelyn's voice came out steadier than she expected. "Where are the photos?" "Just in the hallway closet," Vanessa answered casually, taking a sip. "I didn't throw anything away. Don't worry. I thought we could keep the living area more open and contemporary." Evelyn said nothing. Her fingers remained on the wood as Vanessa walked past her, her perfume trailing behind like sugar and steel. That weekend, Daniel offered to drive Evelyn to the clinic in town for her annual checkup. She usually took herself, but he insisted, saying he wanted to spend time with her. In the car, the windows down to let in the mountain air, he drove slower than usual. "You ever think about making some of this official?" he asked, not looking at her. She glanced at him. "Making what official?" "The house," he said lightly. "I mean, God forbid something happened to you suddenly. It would be chaos trying to handle the legal stuff. Power of attorney, probate, all that." Evelyn stared out the window. "The will's already written." Daniel glanced at her. "You never told me what was in it." "You never asked." He chuckled awkwardly. "Well, I guess I'm asking now." She turned to him. "Why now?" He gave her that disarming grin he used when he was little and wanted to skip violin lessons. "Just thinking ahead, that's all. You know how bureaucratic the state is." Evelyn studied him for a moment. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. There was a sheen of sweat on his temple, and for all his casual tone, he didn't meet her eyes. At the clinic, she passed the tests with flying colors. Heart strong, reflexes sharp, blood work pristine. The doctor told her she had the health of a woman 20 years younger. She laughed politely, then left with a copy of her chart clutched tight in her purse like a silent shield. That night she wandered into the hallway closet. The missing photo albums were there, but shoved behind boxes labeled seasonal decor. Some of the frames had been carelessly stacked, glass pressed against glass. She pulled out the largest one, the photo of Grace on her 25th birthday, holding the pink peonies Evelyn had grown for her. The frame had a crack down the side. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it. Downstairs, she heard Vanessa's laughter echo from the kitchen, followed by Daniel's voice, low and unreadable. She returned the frame gently, then closed the closet door and stood there, her back against the wood. Something wasn't right. She didn't have proof, no argument to shout, no confrontation to demand, but something in her gut, the part of her that had survived betrayal before, that had raised a child on her own, that had mourned silently while smiling through staff meetings, whispered one word: watch. The next morning, Vanessa brought her breakfast in bed. Fresh croissant strawberries, warm tea with lemon. Evelyn thanked her, watching the tray being placed on her lap. Vanessa smiled. "Just wanted to do something sweet for you. You've been so generous letting us stay." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you, it's lovely." "Daniel's going to the hardware store later," Vanessa added. "He's thinking about repainting the upstairs hallway. Maybe freshen it up a bit." Evelyn sipped her tea. "Did I say the hallway needed painting?" Vanessa blinked just once. "No, of course not. It's just, we thought it might brighten things up. You know, make the house feel more lively." Evelyn held her gaze. "The house feels just fine to me." There was a pause too short to be called tension, but long enough to register. Then Vanessa's smile returned. Of course it was just an idea. She left the room quietly. Evelyn looked down at her tray. The strawberries were fresh. The tea was just the way she liked it. And yet, her appetite was gone. Hell. That afternoon, Evelyn walked the perimeter of the house. Not to admire the garden, but to count the windows. One by one. She noted which ones had new curtains, Which ones had been opened that morning? Which doors had locks she hadn't touched in years? Later, she opened the kitchen drawer where she kept her spare keys. One was missing. Her fingers hovered over the others. She closed the drawer slowly. That evening, as Vanessa and Daniel sat on the porch chatting about property values in Pine Brook, how they were rising, how the town was becoming a hidden gem, how people were desperate to get out of the city these days, Evelyn sat in her room and pulled out her old black leather journal. She hadn't written in it since Grace died, but the pages still smelled like ink and eucalyptus. She clicked her pen open and began to write. Not prose, not reflection, just facts, dates, conversations, changes in the furniture, phrases Daniel used that didn't sound like him. The time Vanessa had taken the car without telling her, the missing receipts from the grocery budget, the tone of Daniel's voice when he asked about the will. She wrote until her hand cramped. Then she slid the journal under her pillow, and finally, for the first time in weeks, she slept with her door locked. The hallway light was dimmer than usual that morning. Evelyn noticed it as she stepped out of her bedroom, though she no longer dared to call it that. The door she had just closed behind her didn't even creak the way it used to, probably because Daniel had replaced the hinges last week. Silently, without asking, the hall smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and something else, something artificial, a vanilla lavender spray that made her wrinkle her nose. Vanessa's touch. She moved down the corridor, feeling the cool wood beneath her bare feet. It was too quiet, too still. Then she saw it, the piano. Grace's piano, covered with the beige sheet legs wrapped in bubble wrap, standing like a ghost beside the back door. Next to it sat her favorite rocking chair, the one she'd nursed both her children in, now shoved against the wall like an unwanted relic. Her heart thudded. She turned sharply and made her way to the living room. Half the furniture was missing. The large tapestry from Morocco, the antique sideboard from her parents, even the patchwork quilt she used to drape over the couch. Gone. She stood in the middle of the room, chest tightening, ears ringing. "Good morning." Vanessa's voice rang out cheerfully from the kitchen. "Hope you're hungry. I made oatmeal with almond milk, super heart healthy." Evelyn didn't respond. Vanessa poked her head around the corner, ponytail bouncing. "Oh, by the way, I hope it's okay we're moving your things downstairs." Evelyn blinked. "What?" "To the guest room. The one near the back pantry." Vanessa stepped fully into the room, holding a bowl and a spoon. "We just thought, with the stairs and all. You've mentioned your knees, right? It's just safer. We don't want you to fall." "My knees are fine," Evelyn said, her voice low. "But why risk it, right?" Vanessa smiled brightly. "Besides, it's so much cooler downstairs. That room gets such lovely afternoon light." Evelyn stared at her. Vanessa shrugged, then placed the bowl on the coffee table. "It's already mostly done. Daniel's been moving your books and stuff since last night." She turned and walked off as if that settled everything. And maybe it did. Because by the time Evelyn walked into her old bedroom, her sanctuary, it had already been emptied. The bedding had been stripped, the paintings removed, the armoire, the sewing basket, the porcelain lamp, all gone. She stood in the doorway, stunned. The only thing left was the faint impression of her head on the pillow. The guest room near the pantry was a former utility space. It had no windows, no closet, and walls that smelled faintly of mothballs and paint. Her armchair didn't fit. Her nightstand had been replaced by a folding table. The bookshelf was gone. In its place was a metal rack with 3 neatly folded towels and a stack of Daniel's old business books. She sat on the edge of the mattress, knees touching the hard frame, and tried not to cry. She failed. The tears came slowly at first, then heavier, shaking her chest, leaving her breathless. She cried for the house, for the memories, for the sound of Grace playing piano on Sunday mornings, for the smell of her husband's aftershave before he left for good. She cried because everything was disappearing piece by piece, and no one noticed but her. That afternoon she found the piano again, this time parked unceremoniously in the hallway, its bench missing its keys taped shut with masking tape. She reached out and brushed a hand along its surface. Dust clung to her fingers. The lid was crooked. She knelt, her knees stiff and sore, and pressed her forehead gently against the wood. Grace had played here, right here. Her fingers had danced across these keys. Her laughter had filled this hallway, echoing off the floorboards. Evelyn could still remember the song Debussy's Clair de Lune that Grace used to practice over and over until she got it right. Now the instrument stood like a corpse. She wept again. This time she made sure no one saw. Neighbors stopped calling. At first Evelyn didn't think much of it. People were busy. Life moved on. But then she bumped into Judy and Go from across the street at the post office. Judy, who used to come by every Wednesday morning for tea and lemon cake. Judy, who had once cried on Evelyn's shoulder after her dog passed away. Judy barely made eye contact. "I didn't want to disturb you," she said, shifting her bag awkwardly. "Vanessa said you weren't feeling well, that you needed rest." Evelyn frowned. "I'm fine." Judy smiled tightly. "Well, that's good to hear. I'll let you get back to it." She left before Evelyn could say anything else. That evening, Evelyn watched from the upstairs landing as Vanessa stood at the door talking to Mr. Benson, the mailman. Laughing, gesturing, slipping into a familiarity that felt invasive. She could no longer tell where her home ended and Vanessa began. So Evelyn started writing. Every evening after the house fell quiet, and Vanessa's playlist finally stopped humming through the speakers, Evelyn opened her old black journal and wrote. She recorded every change, every object that disappeared, every conversation that made her feel smaller. She described the tone of Daniel's voice, the calculated kindness in Vanessa's compliments, the absence of questions about her day, and she wrote in detail about the piano. The piano hurt the most. A week later, she bought a camera. Not the big obvious kind, just a discreet palm-sized recording device with motion sensors and cloud upload. The kind of thing one might use to watch pets when away from home. She installed it above the pantry doorway where it had a clean view of the hallway leading to her new room. A second camera went inside her wardrobe. A third went into the sitting room behind the antique clock. Vanessa never noticed. Evelyn began saving the footage every night onto an encrypted flash drive she kept in her undergarment drawer beneath her wool socks and a tin of lavender balm. She labeled it insurance. It wasn't for blackmail, it wasn't revenge, it was truth. Because even in her own house, Evelyn had begun to doubt her version of things. The gaslighting came subtly through smiles and suggestive phrasing. "I thought you said you didn't like that chair, Mom. I'm sure we told you about the plumber's visit. You probably forgot. We checked with the doctor, remember? He said your memory's not what it used to be." Every time she pushed back, she felt ridiculous, like she was the one rewriting reality. So she stopped arguing. She started recording. One morning she woke up to find her books gone. Not just moved. Gone. The shelf she had placed in her corner filled with Camus, de Beauvoir, Hemingway, Morrison had been cleared. Replaced with a row of fake succulents and a diffuser that smelled like oranges. Evelyn found the box of books later that day in the garage. At the bottom. Under Daniel's old baseball gear. She opened the lid and saw Grace's poetry collection sitting crookedly beside a moldy pair of cleats. Her hands shook. She carried the box back inside, placed it beside her bed, and opened Grace's book. The page was folded where she had last left it. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. The words blurred. Evelyn closed the book and placed it back in the box. Then she pulled out her camera remote and checked the footage. Vanessa, 2 nights ago, late, moving swiftly through her room, stacking the books into bags, sighing like it was a chore. Evelyn rewound and watched it again, and again. And again, until the fury inside her quieted into steel. She began locking her door at night. Vanessa noticed within 2 days. At breakfast, she asked it casually. "Everything okay, Evelyn?" "Just noticed the door was locked last night. I sleep better that way," Evelyn said. Vanessa smiled with a flash of teeth. "Of course, security is so important at your age." Evelyn didn't blink. She stirred her coffee slowly, imagining the camera's lens catching every twitch in Vanessa's jaw. Daniel said nothing. He hadn't said much lately. His silences had become longer. His dinners shorter. He rarely met her eyes. Maybe guilt had a sound, and it was silence. The next week, Evelyn received a letter. Not from a friend. From her attorney. It confirmed receipt of her revised will, the secure storage of digital backup copies, and acknowledgement of recent home environment concerns. She placed the letter inside the back of her journal. Then she pulled out a new camera. This one would go in the guest bathroom, just in case. On a rainy Thursday evening, Evelyn passed the living room and paused. Vanessa was in the corner on her phone. "She's old," she was saying, voice sharp and low. It's not like she needs all this space, or knows how to use it. I mean, how many antique chairs does one person need? She should be grateful. A pause, then laughter. Yes, Daniel's warming up to the idea. He just doesn't want to be the bad guy. But once it's in his name, we can renovate. Open the space up. Sell eventually. This area is getting hot. Evelyn walked quietly past the doorway. She didn't speak, didn't confront. Instead, she returned to her room, closed the door, and sat down at her desk. She opened the journal and wrote, "The house has already been taken, but not the truth and not me." Then she tucked the flash drive into her cardigan pocket. Tomorrow she would visit her bank. Tomorrow she would visit her lawyer again. Tomorrow she would begin. The smell of furniture polish was the first thing Evelyn noticed when she came up the basement steps that Saturday morning. Rich, citrusy, almost too clean. It didn't belong to her usual pine-scented routine, the one she'd kept for decades. She paused halfway up the stairs and listened. The sound of the front door swinging shut. Fast footsteps. Silence. When she entered the living room, the first thing she saw was absence. The Limwood dining set, solid handcrafted, passed down from her grandfather, was gone. The chairs. The table with the subtle swirl in the grain, the matching glass cabinet that once held her mother's porcelain dishes, vanished. On the far wall, an empty hook hung where her oil painting used to be, an original landscape of the northern cliffs gifted to her by a former student who had become a painter of some repute. She'd loved that piece, not because of its value, but because of the hands that painted it. Gone. In its place, nothing. Just blank, pale space. She turned slowly. Vanessa was in the kitchen, humming, making coffee, like nothing had happened. Evelyn walked in with deliberate slowness, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where is the dining set?" Vanessa didn't turn. "Oh, that old thing. It was really taking up too much room. We needed more open space." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Where is it?" This time Vanessa turned her smile soft but sharp. "Relax, Evelyn. I sold it." Evelyn's mouth opened slightly. No sound came. "Daniel and I thought it was time for an upgrade," Vanessa continued. "We're thinking sleek, modern lines, maybe a Scandinavian design. We've already ordered a new set. It'll be here next week." "You had no right," Evelyn whispered. Vanessa shrugged and poured coffee into her mug. "We live here now, too. We all have to make decisions together." Evelyn stared at her. "That set belonged to my grandfather, and it was rotting. The polish couldn't hide the scratches anymore." Vanessa sipped. "Besides, it sold for a good price. You should be thanking me." Evelyn's hands trembled. She tucked them behind her back. Vanessa noticed. She grinned. "Try the coffee. I used that French roast you like." Evelyn turned and walked out. Not because she was weak, but because if she stayed she might have broken something, and there was too much at stake to lose her temper. That afternoon, Daniel found her in the greenhouse trimming back the ivy. He came bearing a manila envelope. "Hey, Mom." He gave her that familiar casual smile, the one he wore before breaking bad news. "Got something I need you to look over." Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron. "What is it?" "Just some paperwork. Property stuff. You know, with the way laws are changing, inheritance, capital gains, all that junk, it's just safer if we adjust ownership now. No surprises later." She didn't take the envelope. "Adjust ownership," she echoed. "Just transfer the title to me," he said smoothly. "That way, if anything happens, God forbid, it's already taken care of. It'll make things easier for you. Less bureaucracy. We've been talking to a lawyer. It's pretty standard." Her breath caught. "I have a will," she said flatly. "Wills can be contested," he said gently, as if speaking to a nervous child. "This is cleaner, more practical." She looked down at the envelope, then back at him. "No." He blinked. "Mom, don't be like this. It's just paperwork." "No." The word cut sharper this time. Daniel's smile faltered. "We're just trying to protect what's yours. You don't want the government taking a cut, do you?" Evelyn's voice didn't rise. "You're not protecting what's mine. You're trying to take it." He stiffened. "That's not fair. Neither is asking me to sign away the only thing I've built with my bare hands." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Vanessa and I have made sacrifices, Mom. We moved here. We're investing in this place." "I didn't ask you to," she replied coldly. And with that, she turned her back to him and walked into the house, the sound of her clippers snapping with more force than before. That night the house fell quiet early. Too early. Evelyn stayed in her room, the envelope still lying untouched on her desk. She sat in her chair, a single lamp glowing beside her knitting needles idle in her lap. She could feel it now, the pressure, the squeeze. The walls weren't just changing, they were closing in. The silence outside her door made her uneasy. She stood, moved slowly to the hallway and listened. Faint voices in the kitchen. She stepped quietly barefoot and stopped just around the corner. The voices became clearer. Daniel, she said no, just flat out, no reason. Vanessa. Of course she did. She's being difficult on purpose. She doesn't trust me. She doesn't trust anyone. She still lives like it's 1985. It's not like we're stealing. Still, she's going to make this a nightmare. Only if we let her. Look, once it's signed, we can sell. Flip it. Take the money and move closer to the city. The land alone is worth a fortune. Evelyn's breath froze in her lungs. She's old, Vanessa continued. She's just clinging to stuff that doesn't matter. She barely uses the space. It's wasted on her. There was a pause. Then Daniel, if I push too hard, she'll pull out of everything. Vanessa's voice dropped lower, colder. Then don't push. Just suggest again next week. Wear her down. Smile. Play the dutiful son. Daniel chuckled under his breath. You're scary sometimes. I'm effective. Silence. Then the sound of a cabinet closing. Footsteps. Evelyn slipped back into the hallway shadows, heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. She ducked into the bathroom, waited. When the lights went off again and the house fell silent, she returned to her room. She locked the door. She sat down, and for a long while she didn't move. Not even to cry. Not even to write. The next morning she woke before dawn. She brewed her tea not out of habit but out of necessity. Her hands were steady now, her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. She sat by the window as the sun crept over the trees, and she began. She pulled out her old Rolodex, contacts she hadn't called in years, her attorney in the city, her former financial advisor, a former student who now worked in investigative journalism, her niece a notary. She would make the calls today, set the meetings, gather her documents, secure her assets, update every will, every clause's clause. But more than that, she would prepare for war. Not the kind with fists, the kind with facts, with signatures, with truths immortalized in footage and files and recorded conversations. They wanted her to sign. She would sign nothing. They wanted her to surrender. She would bury them in silence. And when the time came, she would strike not in anger, but with precision. She sipped her tea. Outside, the roses bloomed under the window Grace once leaned out of as a child. Inside, Evelyn Monroe, widow mother, forgotten relic, became something new, an architect of consequence. And the storm was coming. The key was cold between Evelyn Monroe's fingers, thin, unremarkable, worn at the edges. It had been taped to the bottom of the nightstand for nearly 15 years. She hadn't touched it since Grace's funeral. That morning, Evelyn waited until Daniel and Vanessa had left to run errands. She watched them from the dining room window, Vanessa in designer sunglasses, Daniel loading the back of the car with reusable shopping bags like a loyal assistant. Their silhouettes disappeared down the gravel driveway. The moment the engine faded into the valley, Evelyn moved. Upstairs, into her old bedroom. The room was hollow now, gutted of warmth, of softness. But she didn't come for sentiment. She knelt slowly beside the bed, pushed aside the empty frame where her mattress had once rested, and lifted the corner of the hardwood panel. She pulled it free with a creak. Beneath it, a rust-stained metal box stared back at her. She inserted the key. The lock clicked. Inside, she found what they didn't know existed. 6 savings account books, all current, all active. One under her maiden name, another under Grace's initials. Dozens of investment certificates, each neatly labeled. And at the bottom, wrapped in wax paper, were 3 original documents. A 30% ownership certificate in Calix Travel Group, a tourism company that had grown tenfold in the past decade, a notarized profit-sharing agreement, and an appraisal valuing her shares at nearly 38 billion dong. In the city, that amount meant luxury. In Pinebrook, it meant power. She read each line again, hand trembling slightly. She had built this, in secret. From teacher salaries, from monthly savings, from late nights listening to investment podcasts on a broken tablet, from trust placed not in people, but in knowledge, discipline, and time. None of it had been luck. She replaced the documents carefully and closed the box. Then she stood dusted off her knees and walked to the closet. She would go to Saigon today. The taxi arrived just before noon. Evelyn wore her gray coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and her flat leather shoes. She didn't tell Daniel or Vanessa where she was going. She left a note that simply said, "Went to visit an old friend. Back tomorrow." The ride to the city took 4 hours. She stared out the window the entire time, counting the shades of green as the mountains gave way to concrete and dust. The city rose around her like a storm, noisy, quick, endlessly alive. It had been years since she'd walked these streets, but her memory hadn't faded. She knew exactly where she needed to go. District 3, a modest office nestled between a coffee shop and a bookstore. The plaque on the door read, "Dung and Partners, legal advisory since 1982. Inside, the air smelled of paper and jasmine incense. Mr. Dung was older now, white-haired, slower, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "Evelyn," he greeted, removing his glasses. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd ever call again." "I didn't think I'd need to," she said simply. He motioned to the chair. "So, how bad is it?" She handed him the envelope. Her financials, the proof, the inheritance details, the backup footage. His brows rose. He said nothing for a while, flipping through every document with professional detachment. "Then you're sitting on a minefield. They have no idea, do they?" "None." "Good." He pulled out a blank form and uncapped his fountain pen. "Tell me what you want done." Evelyn spoke clearly. "I want to rewrite the will. I want the house excluded from automatic inheritance. I want Daniel removed as sole beneficiary. I want everything transferred to a scholarship fund named after my daughter, Grace Monroe." Mr. Dung nodded slowly. "Any specifications for the fund?" "Yes," she said. "Tuition support for rural girls who want to study the arts or literature. Full ride living expenses. And I want it managed by the independent board we discussed back in 2010, no family members allowed. And the house, let them live there for now. But when I die or sell, it goes to the fund. Any cash to Daniel. Legally required minimum, nothing more." Mr. Dung leaned back and smiled, eyes glittering. "That's going to sting." Evelyn met his gaze. "It's not revenge. It's protection, of legacy, of intention, of who I was before they tried to rewrite me." He nodded once and began drafting. It took 3 hours. During that time, Evelyn signed a stack of papers, recorded a short video to accompany the new will, and uploaded all surveillance clips to a secure cloud account linked to a password-protected backup email. She left a secondary flash drive in Mr. Dung's safe, wrapped in a silk scarf Grace had once worn to piano recitals. As she stood to leave, Mr. Dung placed a hand on hers. "Do you want to notify them?" "No. They'll find out eventually." She smiled faintly. "That's the idea." Outside, the city lights blinked to life, illuminating the skyline with cruel clarity. Evelyn hailed a cab and asked to be driven to the bank on Wenty Min Kai Street. Inside, she deposited the original documents into a private safety deposit box under an alias she had created years ago. Only she and Mr. Dung had access. Not Daniel, not Vanessa, not even the clerk who handled the intake. When the vault door closed behind her with a deep, echoing thud, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in months. Weight shifting, as if a stone on her chest had been lifted and replaced with armor. She returned to Pinebrook the next day, just after noon. Vanessa was in the kitchen making soup. Daniel was sitting on the porch, scrolling his phone. They looked up when the car pulled in. "Hey, Mom," Daniel said. "Everything okay?" She smiled softly. "Just fine." "Where'd you go?" "Old friend," she said. "Some loose ends to tie up." Vanessa poured a ladle of broth into a bowl and carried it to the table. "We were wondering. You didn't answer your phone." Evelyn sat down, unbuttoning her coat. "I turned it off." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That's not like you." She met his eyes without flinching. "A few things are about to change." Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched. Then Evelyn picked up her spoon. "Is that mushroom?" "Shiitake and pearl barley," Vanessa replied, forcing brightness. Evelyn tasted it. "Good," she said. "Thank you." She ate slowly with perfect calm. They didn't see the documents. They didn't hear the click of the vault. They didn't see the real change. But it had already begun, and now it was only a matter of time. The invitations were exquisite embossed ivory cardstock with gold trim sealed in wax and hand-delivered to Pinebrook's elite. The guest list included interior designers, gallery owners, attorneys, and boutique realtors from Napa to Sausalito. Vanessa had curated it like a runway show, only the influential, the fashionable, and the transactional were invited. She wore sapphire blue that evening, hair-curled lips, lacquered eyes set with the perfect wing. Daniel wore a linen suit and loafers without socks, trying to appear effortless. He looked every bit the man of the house if you didn't know who actually owned it. The Monroe estate was glowing. Lanterns were strung along the veranda. Soft music spilled from hidden Bose speakers, and catering staff in black uniforms moved like clockwork. Vanessa's voice chimed out like champagne. "We're just so thrilled to share this next chapter of our lives in such a storied home," she said to a circle of cocktail-drunk guests. "Evelyn, bless her heart, is resting more these days. She prefers to stay downstairs now. The stairs are just too much." She giggled softly. "We've done our best to keep her comfortable in the lower level. It stays cool down there. Good for her joints." Laughter. Shrimp cocktail was passed on silver trays. Jazz hummed. Someone popped a second bottle of imported rosé. None of them saw the door open. None of them were prepared. From the front of the house, heels tapped slowly against aged oak floors. Tap, tap, tap. Heads turned, conversations quieted, and there she was, Evelyn Monroe, standing like a column of shadow and dignity in the entryway, wearing a long black silk gown that flowed to the floor. Her silver hair was gathered in a low knot. She wore no makeup, no jewelry. In one hand she carried a polished wooden box with brass hinges. In the other, nothing, just a silence that pressed against every person in the room. Daniel's face paled. "Mom." She stepped forward, her voice low but laced with steel. "What a lovely evening, quite the spectacle." Vanessa recovered with a smile. "Evelyn, we didn't know you were feeling up for guests." Evelyn's eyes cut through her, clearly. Someone laughed nervously, then silence again. Evelyn lifted the wooden box slightly. "I thought I'd bring something to the party." Daniel took a step forward, glancing at Vanessa. "Mom, maybe we can talk." "No," Evelyn interrupted, voice cold. "Tonight we don't whisper anymore." Then she looked around at the assembled crowd, her voice sharpened. "This is the last party that will ever take place in this house under false names, and the last time anyone here mistakes opportunism for family." A figure appeared behind her, tall, clean-cut. A man in a fitted navy suit holding a leather briefcase. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced calmly, "my name is Thomas Reed, estate attorney for Ms. Evelyn Monroe. I've been authorized to present a declaration of legal and financial notice." Daniel froze. Vanessa's nails dug into her wine glass. Thomas Reed opened the briefcase, removing a leather folder. He flipped it open, reading with precision. As of 3 weeks ago, the Monroe estate, along with all associated assets, real, liquid, and investment-based, has been transferred into the Grace Monroe Educational Fund, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. This includes the property at 241 Elm Ridge Lane, its contents, shares in Monarch Travel Group, and all designated investment accounts. A collective inhale rippled through the room. Reed continued. Ms. Monroe retains full legal authority and has filed documentation under the Elder Protection Act. Daniel Monroe and Vanessa Monroe are hereby stripped of any legal claim to the estate, pending further investigation into attempts at undue influence, coercion, and misrepresentation. Vanessa's voice cracked. "You can't be serious." Evelyn turned to her, gaze icy. "You moved my books without asking. You sold my family's furniture. You erased my daughter from these walls." Her hand tapped the box. "I recorded everything." Daniel took a step forward. "You don't have to do this. I already did." Thomas Reed added, "Audio and video surveillance captured within this residence has been submitted to the county records office. Copies are in secure bank custody. Witnesses have been sworn. Probate court has pre-scheduled a review for next month." Vanessa was shaking now. "This is insane. We've lived here. We've invested." Evelyn raised her voice, not loud, but so cold and clear it hushed the room. "You invested in mirrors and manipulation. You laughed in kitchens you never scrubbed. You paraded around like landlords of a legacy you didn't build." A pause. then softly to the entire room. You threw a party in a house that didn't belong to you and invited the world to applaud your theft. Gasps. Silence. One of the guests awkwardly put down her wine. Daniel looked lost, small. His suit too large, his shoes too tight. You changed, Mom, he muttered. You've become hard. No, she said. I just remembered who I am. Mr. Reed closed the folder. Per terms filed, you have 14 calendar days to vacate the property. Failure to comply will result in court-ordered removal. The Grace Monroe Foundation will assume physical control thereafter. Evelyn stepped forward and placed the wooden box on the coffee table beside a bowl of olives. She opened it. Inside were the black and white photos of her daughter Grace laughing, playing piano, reading by the window. Beneath them, the original trust documents, the signature pages, a flash drive. You were never meant to inherit this, Evelyn said to her son. You were meant to protect it. But you failed. She looked around the room again at the whispers, the turned heads, the frozen faces. Enjoy your rosé, she said. It's the last drop you'll ever taste in this house. Then she turned and walked out, tall, steady, deliberate. The lawyer followed, and behind her the legacy reclaimed its rightful name. Kumku. The room hadn't moved. Not a glass clinked. Not a whisper rose. Evelyn Monroe stood like a pillar at the center of her home, no longer a shadow. The black silk gown she wore felt less like fabric now and more like armor. At her side, attorney Thomas Reed adjusted his folder, his eyes scanning the stunned faces of the guests who were still holding their breath from the last sentence he read. Per the newly executed estate documents, he repeated, Mr. Daniel Monroe is not the sole heir to the Monroe estate. In fact, effective immediately, all inheritance privileges previously assumed have been formally revoked. The only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Daniel's mouth parted, words caught somewhere between shock and rage. What? What do you mean, revoked? Vanessa stepped forward, her heels loud against the floor. This is a joke, right? You can't just change the will like that in secret. Mr. Reed didn't flinch. The law allows full testamentary freedom so long as the testator is of sound mind. Ms. Monroe's mental capacity was certified by 2 independent professionals, signed, stamped, and archived. Daniel turned toward his mother, voice rising with urgency. Why would you do this? I'm your son. Evelyn's voice was soft but unshakable. You were. Then she reached into the wooden box still resting on the table. From inside, she pulled out a small black remote. A projector hummed to life. The living room wall, once covered with a tasteful painting Vanessa had chosen to match the wallpaper, lit up in bluish light. Static, then sound. The recording was grainy but clear. Vanessa's voice. She's old, Daniel. Confused half the time. Just keep smiling, wear her down, and she'll sign. Daniel's reply. Once she signs, we flip the house. Get the cash. That's it. Another clip, a different day. Vanessa. If she refuses again, I swear to God, I'll tell the doctor she's delusional and get her committed. Daniel, just calm down. She's stubborn, but we've got time. I'll take care of it. The silence in the room cracked. Someone gasped. A glass shattered on the floor. Vanessa paled, shaking her head. That's taken out of context. Mr. Reed stepped forward. There is no context in which that level of coercion is legal. Daniel looked like he'd been punched. Mom, why would you record us? Evelyn's gaze was stone. Because I stopped mistaking love for protection the day you looked me in the eye and lied. At that moment, 2 uniformed officers entered through the side hallway. Their presence wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable badges, clipped body cameras blinking. One addressed the group with calm authority. We received a report of financial elder abuse and have been dispatched per standard protective protocol. Until the civil dispute is resolved, all contested assets are temporarily frozen. Any attempt to remove property from this location will be considered tampering with evidence. Vanessa nearly stumbled. You called the police? No, Evelyn said. I called the law. The difference matters now. An officer turned to Daniel. Sir, we'll need you to step outside for preliminary questioning. Your legal counsel is welcome to be present. Daniel looked towards the door, then back at his mother. Please, he said, voice cracking, the first hint of actual desperation seeping in. We didn't mean to hurt you. We were just scared. I thought we could make things easier. Evelyn stepped forward, each step measured, deliberate. "You thought wrong," she said quietly. "You didn't try to help me. You tried to replace me, rewrite me, use me." Vanessa clung to Daniel's arm now. Her voice trembled. "We just wanted a future. We didn't have a choice." Evelyn's voice never rose. It didn't need to. "You had 100 choices, and you made the one where I disappear." One of the officers approached the coffee table. "Ma'am, may I?" he asked, gesturing to the documents and recordings. Evelyn nodded. He bagged the items carefully, then turned to his partner. Evidence tagged. "Let's start the intake." As the officers escorted Daniel and Vanessa into the next room, Evelyn turned back toward the guests, some of whom still hadn't sat down again. She didn't apologize for the interruption. She didn't smile to soften the blow. She simply walked to the piano near the corner Grace's piano and placed one hand on the cover. It had been dusted, cleaned, maybe even tuned, but for years it had sat silent. Tonight it wasn't anymore. One soft key, then another. She didn't play a full song. Just a few notes. Enough to break the silence. Enough to reclaim sound in the space that had been overtaken by theft masked as gratitude. Mr. Reed turned to her. "You handled that with extraordinary restraint." "I wasn't trying to punish them," Evelyn said. "Just stop them." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Behind them, the voices of the officers faded into the hallway. One of them was asking Daniel about signed documents. Another was asking Vanessa about missing antiques. The wind outside shifted. Inside, Evelyn straightened the photo of Grace that had been moved earlier in the week. The one that had mysteriously disappeared from the fireplace and was now quietly returned to its rightful place. She lit a single candle beneath it, not for grief, but for closure. Behind her, Daniel returned, eyes red, shoulders slumped. His tie had been loosened. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "Mom, I know it's too late, but I'm sorry. We got lost in something we didn't understand." Evelyn faced him. "You didn't get lost," she said. "You walked into it." He looked away. "I don't know where we go from here," he said. Evelyn didn't move. "That depends," she said. "Are you still looking for what you can take?" He shook his head, tears beginning to form. "No." "Then maybe," she said gently, "you'll learn what it means to give." She didn't reach for him, didn't touch his shoulder, didn't offer forgiveness. She offered something rarer, a path back, but not an open door. Behind them, Vanessa was sitting on the floor in the foyer, heels, discarded mascara running whispering into her phone. Evelyn turned away, walked to the stairs. One step at a time, she climbed back to the bedroom that had been hers long before anyone else walked through that door, where she had survived heartbreak and betrayal in silence, where she had remembered her name, and finally spoken it aloud. Downstairs, the officers finished their work. The guests slipped out the side exits, suddenly unsure of the people they'd come to celebrate. And the house took a breath and exhaled something it had been holding in for far too long. Truth, justice, and the sound of a woman who had taken the last key and used it to lock the door on everything that no longer served her. The court order came down on a Wednesday morning. Stamped in red ink and delivered by registered courier, it arrived in a plain manila envelope marked "Immediate action required." A sheriff's deputy stood by as Daniel opened the envelope, his fingers fumbling. It was short, direct. Temporary injunction. All transfer, sale, modification, or occupancy-based claims related to the property at 241 Elm Ridge Lane are hereby suspended pending final judicial review. Beneath the legal language was something colder power had shifted. Permanently. Daniel didn't speak for a long time. He stared at the papers like they might burst into flames and reverse themselves. They didn't. Vanessa sat across the table, pale and silent, scrolling on her phone. And there it was, the storm they couldn't contain. The video. Clips from Evelyn's projector had been anonymously uploaded to the internet the night before. A 2-minute compilation, Daniel coercing Vanessa, threatening their voices, clear faces sharp under poor hallway lighting. Protect Evelyn Monroe was trending within 12 hours. By morning, Evelyn's name had appeared on national news. Retired teacher wins legal battle against son's inheritance scheme. Reddit threads dissected the audio. A popular TikToker recreated the confrontation scene word for word in front of her parents' fireplace. Elder law forums exploded. People picked sides, though mostly they didn't have to. The facts were clear. Evelyn hadn't said a word to the press. She didn't have to. The footage spoke for her. By Thursday, Vanessa was summoned to Human Resources at her firm's San Francisco branch. She arrived in all black, hoping to look composed. The HR director didn't bother with pleasantries. "We've reviewed the footage, and while this is a private matter, your position here includes fiduciary trust. After conferring with legal, we're terminating your contract effective immediately." Vanessa didn't cry. She blinked once, asked if she could clear her desk herself. The answer was no. At the same time, Daniel received a terse email from the startup board, where he had invested 3 years prior. His shares were being bought out in light of recent reputational concerns. The founders no longer felt comfortable associating the brand with his name. He called, left voicemails, pleaded for reconsideration. No one called back. For the first time since they'd moved into Evelyn's home, the silence wasn't hers. It was theirs. Deafening. Meanwhile, Evelyn packed. There was no rush, no drama. She moved slowly through the house she had lived in for nearly 5 decades, collecting what she needed and leaving the rest behind. There were no boxes, just 3 large suitcases and 1 small velvet bag. In her bedroom, she folded letters from Grace into a manila folder, tucked in a dried lily pressed between journal pages, smoothed the sheet music still resting on the piano bench. She didn't clean, she didn't scrub the floors. This wasn't a goodbye with bows and ribbons. This was an exit, a quiet one, a deliberate one. In the study, she opened the drawer where the first deed to the house had once sat. Now it was empty. She filled it instead with a handwritten letter dated and signed. Then she placed the house key in a white envelope. Nothing fancy, just paper, just closure. It was Friday afternoon when she finally stepped out onto the front porch. She wore gray trousers and a cream coat. No makeup, no handbag. The breeze carried pine and the distant scent of wood smoke. On the driveway, a local volunteer from the Women's Community Center stood by a navy blue sedan. The trunk was open. Her name was Lisa. She was maybe 30, soft-spoken, kind eyes. "Ready, Miss Monroe?" she asked. Evelyn nodded once. Inside the house, Vanessa stood at the top of the stairs, disheveled and glassy-eyed. She didn't say a word. Daniel emerged from the hallway, his voice low and brittle. "You don't have to do this." Evelyn paused on the last step. "You're right," she said softly. "I don't." She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the envelope, and handed it to Lisa. "This is for the county clerk. Transfer of symbolic custody. The house will go to the Grace Monroe Foundation trustees next quarter. Until then, the property's under freeze." Lisa nodded, placing it in her bag. Daniel tried again. "We made mistakes. Terrible ones. But we're still family." Evelyn turned to him, her face unreadable. "Family," she said, "doesn't destroy what it claims to love." Vanessa stepped closer, voice cracking. "Where will you go?" Evelyn's answer came with no bitterness, only truth. "Someplace quieter, where no one erases my name from the wall." Lisa offered her arm. Evelyn didn't take it, just gave a gentle smile and walked herself to the car. Before she opened the door, she turned once more to face the house. Not them, the house. She looked at its windows, its roofline, its garden now overgrown. This was where she had raised Grace, taught literature to children, cried when her husband left, learned to invest, watched rain dance across the porch ceiling, built a quiet empire from scraps and sacrifice. Her fingers grazed the doorframe one last time. Then she turned away and didn't look back. Hey, the news broke fully by Sunday. Local woman donates multi-million-dollar estate to Girls' Scholarship Foundation. Photos of Evelyn in her classroom surfaced gray chalk dust on her black sweater, a half smile on her face as she handed a novel to a young student. The Grace Monroe Foundation received dozens of small donations, a few large ones, and hundreds of letters. One from a girl in Texas: "I didn't know people like you existed. You gave me hope that it's not too late to be brave." One from a woman in her 60s: "I wish my mother had had your strength. Maybe then she wouldn't have died with someone else's name on the deed." The house stayed quiet. No more parties. No more performances. Just dust settling, truth rooting. And inside, somewhere near the back staircase, Daniel sat with a photo of him and Grace, 8 and 16 knees in the dirt planting tomatoes with Evelyn. He looked at it for a long time and wept. Not because he lost the house, but because he finally understood what it had cost to build it. The first morning at the Lavender Abbey was quiet. Not the cold kind of quiet, but the kind that settled gently into the skin like steam from a cup of tea. Pine trees lined the hills behind the monastery, tall and stately, like old sentinels watching over the valley. Their needles whispered in the wind. Somewhere nearby, a wood thrush sang its first notes of the day. Evelyn Monroe stood on the narrow balcony outside her small room, wrapped in a light cardigan. The stone beneath her feet was cool. She could smell jasmine growing along the edge of the garden wall. Her suitcase sat unopened on the bed. There was no rush now. Inside the abbey, the rhythm was unhurried bells, footsteps on tile, soft conversations, bread rising in a kitchen. The sisters moved like breath, unassuming, precise. No one asked why she was here. No one questioned her name. That was part of what she had come for. To be unremarkable again. To be still. The Lavender Abbey wasn't truly a religious monastery, not anymore. It had once belonged to an order of teaching sisters, but now served as a retreat for retired women, many of them former educators, artists, or caregivers. It was tucked between two low ridges in the northern hills outside Pine Brook, surrounded by lavender fields that turned the air into something holy each June. Evelyn had learned about it from a former colleague who had retired early and never looked back. "It's not heaven," she had said with a smile, "but it's the first place that felt like mine." There were only 6 other women in residence when Evelyn arrived, each with her own small room, each living with quiet intention. Evelyn's room was modest, a single bed, a writing desk, a window that opened to the east. On the first day, she placed a photograph of Grace on the windowsill facing the rising sun. That was all she brought. No silver, no art, no piano. Only what mattered. Within a week, Evelyn found herself drawn to the small schoolhouse attached to the rear wing of the abbey, a one-room building with cracked wooden floors, dusty bookshelves, and a chalkboard that had been dark for years. The children arrived first out of curiosity. They were from the nearby village kids who'd grown up on farms, helped their parents harvest herbs and berries, and rarely ventured beyond the next ridge. Some had never heard French spoken aloud. The first time Evelyn introduced herself, they giggled at her accent. The second time, they asked for more. By the end of the month, the Lavender Abbey had something it hadn't seen in decades, a full classroom. Evelyn taught French in the mornings, basic phrases, greetings, how to describe the sky, and poetry in the afternoons. She pulled faded copies of Baudelaire and Prévert from the Abbey's attic and made new worksheets by hand. The children wrote their own verses and pinned them to the wall with clothespins. She never asked them about their homes. They never asked her why her eyes sometimes glistened when she translated certain lines. It was enough that they came back. Every day, smiling, hungry to learn. Saturdays were different. That was the day Evelyn kept for herself. She'd sit in the Abbey's herb garden with a cup of jasmine tea and sheets of rice paper. Using a fine-tipped brush, she began teaching herself calligraphy again. First in English, then French, then eventually in Vietnamese. She hadn't written her native tongue since her 20s. Now the curves returned like old friends, not always easily, but honestly. Visitors came on Saturdays, neighbors, former students, a few old friends who had found her story through the papers or word of mouth. Some brought vegetables, others brought curiosity. Most brought silence. No one needed answers. They just wanted to sit beside the woman who had once stood in front of a room full of children and asked them to believe in words. One afternoon, a man in his 40s arrived unannounced. He wore a pressed shirt, a camera bag slung across his shoulder, and eyes that looked startled to see her in real life. "Miss Monroe," he asked quietly. She turned from her calligraphy table, surprised by the voice. "Yes." He stepped forward, hesitant. "My name's Benjamin Ellis. I was in your literature class, sophomore year. You gave me a copy of The Old Man and the Sea when I told you I hated books." Evelyn smiled faintly. "And did you ever finish it?" He chuckled. "Twice. I still have the copy." He took a slow breath. "I'm a journalist now, freelance. I read about what happened. I was wondering if you'd let me interview you. Not about the house, not about the lawsuit, about this." He looked around at the lavender, the schoolhouse, the chalk dust on her hands. "About your second life." She studied him for a long moment, then gestured for him to sit. He pulled out a recorder, a notebook, then paused. "May I ask you the first question?" She nodded. "What does this place mean to you?" Evelyn looked at the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the ridge, the scent of pine and lavender braided in the air. Her voice was calm. "Freedom." He waited. She continued, fingers trailing the rim of her teacup. "For most of my life, I lived to preserve things. My daughter's legacy, my family's dignity, my home. I thought that was my duty." She looked at him now, eyes steady. "This is the first time I've lived for myself. Not for anyone else's expectations, not to prove anything, just to be." She gave a quiet smile. "I call it my second breath." Benjamin swallowed hard and wrote it down. The article came out 2 weeks later, titled "A Second Breath: The Lavender Rebirth of Evelyn Monroe." It wasn't sensational. There were no quotes from Daniel, no court drama, just her words, her garden, her students, her grace. The final paragraph read, "There is no bitterness in her voice, no crusade, just a woman who learned after 74 years that peace doesn't arrive when the world gives it to you. It comes when you finally decide to give it to yourself." The Lavender Abbey received letters, donations, paint sets, French novels, volunteers, and Evelyn. She kept teaching, not to fill time, but because it finally felt like time was hers to give. The morning sunlight poured gently through the classroom's open window, filtering between lavender vines and casting golden shapes across the faded chalkboard. Outside, pine trees swayed in rhythm with the wind, sending soft whispers through the valley that embraced the Lavender Abbey. Inside the small room, Evelyn Monroe stood in front of a group of 12 children. They sat at handmade desks in mismatched chairs, their notebooks open, pencils sharpened, eyes wide with curiosity. On the board behind her were simple French phrases. "Bonjour, je m'appelle, j'ai 10 ans." A boy in the front row, no older than 9, raised his hand. "Madame Anne," he asked shyly, "how do you say hope in French?" Evelyn smiled, warm and calm. She walked to the board, lifted a piece of chalk, and wrote it slowly, "Espoir." Then she turned and repeated it with soft precision. "Espoir," she said again, her voice as gentle as the breeze outside. The children echoed her, some awkwardly, some with pride. A few giggled. She loved the way they stumbled forward, not perfect, but fearless. That was what this classroom had become, a space where fear did not belong, a place for rediscovery, not just for the children, but for her too. Word had spread far beyond the hills about the little classroom in the Abbey. After Benjamin Ellis's article was published, the Grace Monroe Foundation received an influx of support, modest donations from across the country, offers of books, school supplies, and even volunteer hours. One envelope contained a letter from a woman in Maine with a $50 bill tucked inside. It read, "For the madame who teaches children words they'll never forget." The foundation created its first official initiative, the Grace Monroe Village Scholarship, awarded annually to rural children showing early linguistic talent or poetic expression. The first recipient was a girl from Evelyn's class, a 12-year-old named Clara, who wrote a haiku about silence that made Evelyn quietly cry after class. The room expanded. More children came. 2 older students volunteered to help with lesson planning. The Abbey converted a second storage room into a mini library. The laughter, the rhythm of language, and the scent of lavender blended together into something sacred. Evelyn never once mentioned the house in Pinebrook again. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, while the children were outside picking wildflowers for their poetry assignment, Evelyn sat at her desk alone. A fresh notebook lay open before her. She wrote 3 words on the first page: "The First Breath." It was not a book about grief. It was not a courtroom story. It was not even about betrayal. It was about waking up one day at 74, realizing that the world had told you who to be your entire life, and finally deciding not to listen. She began with the letter Grace had left behind before she passed. Then the garden, the piano, the moments she'd taught with a broken heart and no one had noticed. She wrote every morning before sunrise in long flowing script, each word a small rebellion against forgetting. The children began calling her Madame Anne one spring morning after she recited a poem she had written under that name. It was a tribute to Grace. She didn't explain who Grace was, but she let the name stick. There was something lovely about it, how the old and the new blended in one breath. the French title from a lifetime ago, the Vietnamese name she'd been born with. Together they became something quietly defiant. Madame Anne, the children called as they arrived. Madame Anne, I wrote a story. Madame Anne, can I stay after class? She smiled every time, never correcting them. That was who she was now. Not Evelyn the widow, not Evelyn the betrayed, not even Evelyn the mother. Just a woman with soil on her hands and ink on her fingers, alive. And then one afternoon, quiet and unannounced, he came. Daniel. She saw him first through the classroom window. He didn't approach. He stood beneath the tall pine tree near the path, hands in his jacket pockets, face turned slightly away, as if unsure whether he had come for forgiveness or simply the chance to witness something purer than his memory. He looked thinner, older. He wore the same jacket from the night of the party, but it hung looser now. A man shedding layers of pride, not fast enough to keep warm. Evelyn continued her lesson. Repeat after me, she said gently. J'aime écrire des poèmes. I love to write poems. The children echoed her. Outside the window, Daniel didn't move. He just watched. Watched her lips form words he didn't understand. Watched children light up under the sound of her voice. Watched the woman he had once tried to control. Now utterly free. He didn't speak. He didn't step closer. He simply let his eyes fill. And when the lesson ended and the children began packing their bags, Evelyn finally turned. Her gaze found his. Time folded. There was no apology, no confrontation, just breath. Just two people standing on opposite sides of a life, and realizing too late maybe, or just in time, that there was still something between them that hadn't died. She nodded. A small gesture, soft, but it landed with the weight of an entire life. Daniel bowed his head, and the tears came not loud, not ugly, just true. He turned before the children could see him cry, disappearing down the path between the trees, swallowed by the same silence that had once defined their family. Evelyn watched until he vanished. Then she turned back to the chalkboard, picked up the eraser, and gently wiped the phrase, J'ai 74 ans. I am 74 years old. She replaced it with a single word, Aujourd'hui, today. Then she smiled, because that was enough, because now truly she had begun. The security vault hummed with chilled silence. Evelyn Monroe stood alone in the private viewing chamber of Pinebrook National Bank, her small frame dwarfed by the metal walls that surrounded her. She wore her simplest gray coat, a black scarf folded neatly under her chin. Her hands, though steady, showed the fine tremble of time, not fear, not hesitation, just age respectfully earned. In her right hand she held a small brass key, the very last one. She didn't rush. She stepped to the safety deposit box, box 611, her daughter's birthday, in reverse, and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, not dramatic, not heavy, but final. Inside lay the familiar contents, a sealed folder labeled Estate Closure, her original birth certificate, a faded photograph of Grace laughing on a swing, and a simple-bound journal titled The First Breath. She placed a new document inside an official statement, declaring the property at 241 Elm Ridge Lane permanently transferred to the Grace Monroe Foundation, free of all personal claims. The chapter was not just over. It was filed. She closed the box, gently locked it again, then withdrew the key. And this time, instead of tucking it back into her purse, she laid it on the metal shelf, left it there, walked away. Outside the day was clear. The wind smelled of pine and lavender, the faintest trace of spring already lifting from the edges of the forest. Evelyn stepped out of the building, pausing on the top step. Her breath was steady, unburdened. A voice echoed softly in her mind. Not memory, but truth, now reclaimed. It's not losing everything that teaches you what you have left. It's knowing finally that you were always worthy of living, even if you learned it too late. Back at the Lavender Abbey, the sun was already climbing. Children lined up outside the converted classroom waiting. Some with books, others with wildflowers, one with a handmade card that read, Merci Madame Anne, in colored crayon. Inside, Evelyn opened the windows wide. She watered the single orchid on her desk, smoothed the hem of her blouse. And then she heard it, footsteps pounding, joyful shrieks, and the kind of laughter that came only from the belly of freedom. She smiled, set her notebook aside, and stepped out into the sunlight. The children were gathered around her motorbike. It was old, rusted at the handles, its paint chipped in places. but it roared like a faithful dog when she turned the key. The back had been fitted with a cushioned seat and wooden sidecar custom-built by a local craftsman and painted with lavender swirls by the children themselves. "Are we really going all the way to the school in the village?" Clara asked, eyes wide with wonder. Evelyn tightened her helmet strap. "We are. Even you, Madame Ein." She smiled, pulling on her riding gloves. "Especially me." They climbed aboard in pairs, the smallest tucked into the sidecar, the older ones gripping the handlebars like seasoned adventurers. Someone yelled "Go!" and someone else screamed with delight. And then they were off. The bike sputtered once, then steadied as it charged up the gravel path, children squealing with joy. Evelyn steered them through the trail, winding past rows of pine trees, past wild lavender, brushing their ankles past sunlight dappling the road in gold. The sound of laughter rose like music behind her clear, sharp honest. From a distance, Daniel watched again. Hidden behind the bend of the hill, he saw the motorbike surge forward. The woman at its helm, no longer a shadow of her past, but the heartbeat of something reborn. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He just smiled, and for the first time in years let the tears fall without shame. The road opened up to the village schoolyard. As the motorbike pulled in, children ran to greet them, some waving, others holding books or lunchboxes. The headmistress came out wiping flour from her apron. "Well, I'll be," she laughed. "They told me you were coming, but I didn't expect you to arrive with your own parade." Evelyn parked carefully, dismounted, helped the smallest ones down. "No sense arriving quietly," she said with a wink. She passed the keyring, this time to Clara. "Here," she whispered. "You hold it now." Clara gasped. Evelyn nodded. "You're ready." Clara grinned so hard she nearly dropped it. The other children gathered around her like petals folding toward light. That night the wind rolled gently through the hills. The Lavender Abbey was quiet again. Evelyn sat by the window, her notebook in her lap. The fire crackled nearby, but she didn't write. Not tonight. Tonight she simply listened. To the trees, to the stillness, to the soft echoing laughter that lingered even now. She closed the notebook, stared at the last page. It read only this: "The final key doesn't open doors, it opens the heart." She closed her eyes and smiled. Fade to black. White text appears on screen. "The last key doesn't open a door, it opens the heart."